You're listening to an Ono Media podcast.
Good morning, and thanks for joining me for Rise in Crime, your morning caffeine hit all about crime. I'm Mama Jules, and let's have an update to the death of a 12-year-old that occurred at a youth camp for troubled teens. Now, the boy, who has only been identified by the initials CJH, was found dead in his sleeping quarters less than 24 hours after he arrived at the camp. And before I tell you more of this tragic story, I need to explain what a bivvy is. In this case, the bivvy was a one-man tent or a shelter. It was very small. Some bivvies are bigger and they can hold up to 2 to 4 people. But on that night, CJH was placed in a single-person bivvy. I also need to tell you about this controversial North Carolina wilderness therapy camp known as TRS Carolina Camp. It was located on Lake Toxaway and would advertise their services as a therapeutic wilderness program that aims to improve the lives of children and teens. Now, a 3-month stay for a child could cost emotionally exhausted parents upwards of $30,000. Now, the organization was founded in 2008 to help families and children that are struggling with significant mental health challenges. Previously, on their website, in the About Us section, the camp was offered as the last bit of hope for some families. The description stated the following: "Our typical family has exhausted all local resources with school counselors, outpatient therapists, and other mental health professionals. Since its founding, TRS has helped make a difference in the lives of more than 2,800 adolescents. Today, we are proud of all that our 200-employee workforce does to help others. Their work is proven in the 5-year outcome study that shows decreases in students' anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, and substance abuse." All right. Armed with that information, let's talk about what happened on February 3rd of this year, when officers were alerted in the early morning hours to the death of a 12-year-old at TRS Carolina. When they arrived, they found the boy lying on the floor of the bunkhouse, naked from the waist down, with his pants and underwear on the floor near his right shoulder. The counselors, when asked, said they did not know how he got there or why he was dressed or undressed in that fashion. Now, the boy did seem to have bruising around his face, and a CPR mask was located nearby, so the bruising could have come from that. And investigators learned the boy had arrived the night before, and it wasn't voluntarily. So, as expected, he was being loud and irate on that night. The parents of CJH had paid for 2 strangers to escort him from his home in New York to the TRS Carolina Camp. Now, I've done some research on this, and the child rarely knows that the event is going to occur. Workers of these facilities will just show up at the child's home and take him or her from his family to a facility out of state in hopes to change behaviors with drastic therapy. Now, CJH had been diagnosed with ADHD, anxiety, migraines, and social challenges. On that night, he refused to eat dinner. Now, the counselors did provide him with some snacks later that evening. At least that's what they told investigators. And admittance to the TRS Carolina Camp had a standard procedure, which is that all new members must sleep for their first night in a bivvy on the hardwood floor of a small square structure they call a bunkhouse. Okay, here's what the bivvy looked like. Underneath the bivvy was a heavy plastic about 6 feet long. On top of the plastic is the bivvy that has one side completely flat and collapsed down, but the other end is held up with a flex pole. So kind of think of a tent with only one end elevated off of the human that would be sleeping in the tent. Now, CJH was provided with a sleeping bag inside the bivvy, but once inside the bivvy, CJH would be zipped in there, it would be zipped shut, and a small alarm is attached that will go off if the occupant inside tries to exit or, in this case, escape the bivvy. Well, CJH was placed in that bivvy that night, but the mesh that covered the opening was torn. So counselors took a very drastic measure. They used a weather-resistant door to secure the opening to CJH's bivvy, and they sealed that shut and attached the same alarm that would alert counselors if CJH tried to leave. Now, around midnight, investigators discovered that CJH was having a panic attack. Counselors were in the room while he was experiencing the attack, but no indications were provided that they tried to help or aid or step in any way. Counselors claimed during initial interviews that CJH could exit the bivvy at any time, yet the procedure would have to have the counselor remove the altered exterior door. Now, counselors then said they checked on CJH at 3 a.m. and 6 a.m., and then he was found cold and stiff at 7:45 a.m. All right, detectives were told other boys were in the bunkhouse, but when they attempted to interview those boys, the detectives were denied access by the TRS Carolina staff. They also refused to release any vital information about those boys, like names or dates of birth or even places of residence. And according to search warrants, the Transylvania County Department of Social Services attempted to check on the welfare of the 4 other kids, but they were met with the same refusal. No information, no names, and no contact. Now, these young kids just witnessed a death, and the camp organization is not allowing them to receive outside care. And you might be thinking, can't you just find them on the campsite in the area? Well, TRS Carolina has 4 different locations in the mountains of North and South Carolina, so the juveniles could have and were most likely transported to other locations. According to a statement released from TRS Carolina, this just 5 days after CJH's death, they said the following: TRS staff initiated life-saving efforts and called EMS and the sheriff, and our staff have fully cooperated with local law enforcement's investigation, voluntarily presenting themselves for interviews with law enforcement and other related public agencies. Any assertion to the contrary is false, reckless, and defamatory. No other students were involved in any way, and all students were moved immediately so as to minimize the impact on them. Our students have cooperated to the extent authorized by their parents. All right, they then added the following. TRS has conducted an internal investigation of this incident, and the TRS facility has been investigated by outside professionals who are subject matter experts. Both investigations have concluded that there is no evidence that TRS failed to properly supervise, no evidence that TRS caused harm, and no evidence that conditions at TRS were unsafe or unhealthy. All right, these statements were before detectives released the information they found in their warrants. After those details were released, they then put out another statement, and here's what TRS said. TRS is aware of the contents of the search warrant, and we are saddened for the family to have these details made public. The search warrant document contains misleading statements. There are details we will not address at this time, out of respect for the family and the investigation that is still underway. We can address the statement that TRS prevented children from speaking to investigators. TRS asked parents' permission for any children involved to speak with law enforcement and state regulatory agencies, and we complied with each parent's preference, as we are required by law to do. Children were moved from the area to protect them from seeing what was happening, not to avoid investigation. We are a mental health facility treating children with severe, complex mental health diagnoses. Not moving children from the area would have harmed their mental well-being. TRS maintains there is no evidence of criminal conduct or suspicious acts based upon all knowledge available to us and information and statements from involved agencies. TRS and all related personnel have not been charged with any crimes. Knowing the truth about what caused the loss of this young boy's life is what matters, and we eagerly await the report by the chief medical examiner. Well, they don't have to wait any longer. The medical examiner's report was released last week, and it states that CJH died from asphyxia due to smothering. The report clarifies that in this exact death, the nose and mouth were covered with a material that was not breathable. The report also mentions the bivvy that CJH was sleeping in, or having a panic attack in, or eventually dying in. I don't feel like sleeping gives the exact context of what that night was for CJH. Well, that autopsy report said, bivvies typically include warnings against fully enclosing the weather restraint outer layer, as it may lead to condensation and breathing restriction. All right, You're probably asking about his pants and underwear being off. Was there sexual assault? The autopsy report stated there were no signs of trauma or sexual assault. And the report also said that counselors couldn't reasonably check on CJH because the weather-resistant barrier made the bivvy opaque. They couldn't see him, so how could they check on him? Well, because of this, the death was certified as a homicide. But despite the report, Transylvania County Sheriff's Office has yet to file any criminal charges. They did comment and say they are including the autopsy report in their investigation into the death of CJH, and that they are now going to consult with the local district attorney. And let me settle some fears that you might have. TRS Carolina was forced to close its doors in May, 3 months after CJH's death. And the specific location where CJH died, well, it was closed down just 2.5 weeks after his death. 18 children were removed from that specific location, and in some cases, the parents were required to travel to get their children. The parents were told if they didn't come to retrieve their children, the juveniles would be handed over to the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, the 3 other locations were ordered to stop all new admissions until the investigation was completed. And when news of CJH's death was released, people began talking about their experience at TRS Carolina. Kathleen Riley said she was awakened in the middle of the night in 2012 with her dad saying that he loved her, but that these strange people in her bedroom would be the ones taking care of her now. She was just 16 years old, and she had no idea what was going on. She told WBTV that one of the strange men looked at her and said, "Get the F up, you're going to camp." Except he said the real word. She then reached for her phone, but it had already been confiscated. And that same man then told her she could do this the easy way or the hard way. He was holding restraints in his hand as a threat. He then told her the police had notified them that she was a danger to herself and others. He said if she ran, he would tackle her. She explained that her time at the camp was spent with a group of 8 to 12 students that were living in tents in the wilderness. Her group was usually manned by 3 counselors who were not trained therapists, and most of the time they worked for minimum wage. She told the reporter that she once went 17 days without being provided the opportunity to shower. Another camp attendee shared their experience and said he was not allowed basic hygiene options. This included not being able to use the bathroom when you needed to. He said at one point, he defecated in his pants because he was not allowed bathroom privileges. He was then forced to wear those soiled pants for 2 weeks. Now, one other camper told NBC News that when she arrived at camp, she was allowed no contact with her parents. On day 3, she was handed a letter from her parents, and she was asked to read it aloud to her group. This was the practice for all new admits to the program. She said that letter basically told her everything she had done wrong in her life, blaming her and shaming her for her choices. Now, Jonathan Hyde, he's a former employee of TRS Carolina. He spoke to WBTV, and he said that his professional background was in outdoor guiding. He thought that his job would be to just help these kids navigate wilderness living. But he was astonished to find that some of the kids were vocally expressing suicidal thoughts. He had kids running away. He had other teens becoming physically violent with him. Jonathan said he was provided 3 days of training before he was asked to man the day-to-day aid these juveniles with serious mental health challenges would need. TRS Carolina told investigators that they provided 6 days of training. Okay, 6 versus 3. That doesn't seem significant to me. Neither is appropriate. And this isn't the first time that a teen has died while in the care of TRS Carolina. In 2015, 17-year-old Alec Lansing, he ran away from his group while on an excursion. After Alec created some distance between him and his group, he climbed a tree to avoid detection. Sadly, he fell from that tree and landed in a stream, breaking his femur. His injury was so severe that he could not move, and he laid there, dying in that stream. His body was found 12 days after he left the group. Now, a DHHS report that investigated the death of Alec Well, that report found that a deputy with the local sheriff's office discovered that TRS Carolina had waited over 5 hours after Alec left the group before calling for law enforcement's help. The DHHS investigator determined that if the staff had not delayed for 5 hours, they could have possibly found Alec alive. Well, TRS Carolina was fined $12,000 for the violations in policy that potentially led to Alec's death, but they were allowed to continue to operate. And investigators in CJH's death, well, they discovered that due to COVID-19 lockdowns, inspections at the camp had all but halted. The last 3 inspections occurred in 2016, 2018, and 2019. No one had physically stepped on site at any of the 4 locations since 2019. And I know you guys know about other facilities like TRS Carolina. Let's talk about a few of them. Recently, 2 programs in Wyoming were accused of forcing teens to do heavy farm work and using humiliating tactics to punish those teens if they didn't comply. And then there's the Circle of Hope Girls Ranch in Missouri. They were charged with over 100 counts of abuse for their actions towards teens. And then the Diamond Ranch Academy in Utah was forced to shut down when 17-year-old Taylor Goodridge died in their care. And then just recently, Paris Hilton testified before Congress on behalf of children that are abused by the foster care and troubled teen system. She's been active for years, advocating for juveniles who experience care away from their parents. She was a patient in 4 youth facilities when she was a child. You can watch her documentary called This Is Paris on YouTube. Well, after researching this story, I have no answers, you guys. We have severe mental health challenges with our youth, and those challenges were only increased tenfold following the COVID-19 lockdowns. My own son is a registered nurse who is currently studying to become a DNP in the psychiatric field. I asked him once, how many troubled youths does he actually feel like he makes a difference with? His answer was shocking. He said maybe 1 or 2 out of every 20. You guys, he feels like he experiences success 1 out of 20 times. Now, his ability to help is limited because you can't alter family dynamics. You can't alter outside forces. So one-on-one help can only aid a portion of a child's mental health challenge. I do know this: shame tactics will never achieve healthy outcomes, ever. And as long as these facilities use those tactics, juveniles will continue to be harmed. I will keep you updated on the investigation into CJH and his tragic death. Now, I've told you on Rise in Crime before that people ask me what case haunts me the most or what case has been so difficult to cover, and I never hesitate with my answer. It's the Uvalde school shooting. And finally, last week, a Uvalde County grand jury indicted former school district police chief Pete Arredondo and school resource officer Adrian Gonzalez. They were indicted on charges of child endangerment. Now, these are the first criminal charges brought against law enforcement for the botched response to the deadliest school shooting in Texas history. Remember, in that shooting, 19 fourth graders and 2 teachers were gunned down by one shooter, while law enforcement officers waited 77 minutes before confronting the gunman. The gunman was ultimately killed by Border Patrol agents who acted without Pete Arredondo's permission. Now, the grand jury was convened in January of this year to determine who, if any, of the nearly 400 federal, state, and local officers involved in the response should be charged. Well, after the shooting, about a dozen officers were either fired, they were suspended, or they actually chose to retire early. Most of those officers were shown on surveillance camera footage, standing in the hallway while bullets continued to be fired, while children inside the classroom were contacting 911, and also while Pete Arredondo searched for a key to a door that was ultimately found to not be locked. Now, some of you might be asking, why only the 2 men being charged? Well, it's not clear if more charges are pending. And in Texas, you've got to remember, grand jury testimony and proceedings are kept secret. So until the charges are brought, no one knows what is happening on the outside. Now, police officers have legal protections that make it difficult to successfully bring criminal charges against them, and the charges might not result in a conviction. The U.S. Supreme Court has held that officers don't have a constitutional duty to protect and serve, even if they are trained to do so. Legal experts have said prosecutors may have a difficult burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that officers were under a legal duty to act, and in failing to do so, caused harm. Now, the grand jury investigation is one of at least 6 official probes launched after the shooting. Those investigations have largely left family members of the victims frustrated. Those family members, along with community activists, well, they've continued to push for increased transparency and accountability. I covered the most recent findings following an investigation into the shooting on Rise in Crime back on March 11th. On that episode, I shared with you that the city of Uvalde's investigation cleared all local officers of any wrongdoing in the incident. Make sure you listen to that episode if you want to hear the frustrated parents of the children that were killed in the massacre. I included audio of several parents as they rightfully expressed anger and frustration at city leaders and private investigator Jesse Prado, who conducted the review. Now, in the absence of concrete action by elected officials, some families have filed civil lawsuits. Relatives of 17 of the children killed and the 2 who were injured sued DPS in May, the day before the second anniversary of the shooting. The families also reached a $2 million settlement with the city of Uvalde, and the city committed to providing enhanced training for current and future law enforcement officers. Relatives have also filed a separate lawsuit against Daniel Defense. All right, that's the company that manufactured the shooter's gun, as well as California-based companies Meta and Activision. Well, Pete Arredondo was formally charged with 10 counts of child endangerment. He turned himself in to the Uvalde County Jail and then was released on a $10,000 bond. Adrian Gonzalez, well, he was indicted on 29 counts of child endangerment. That's 1 count for each child that was in the classroom. Gonzalez, who had SWAT training, was on school grounds on the day of the shooting, yet he didn't act in the initial moments. And now to an update to the lawsuits that have been filed against Sean P. Diddy Combs. I told you all about those lawsuits back on a Rise in Crime episode from March 28th and then also May 23rd. Along with those lawsuits that were accusing Diddy of sex trafficking and assault, a video surfaced of him allegedly abusing his girlfriend Cassie in a hotel hallway. Well, more has surfaced in the ongoing P. Diddy saga, and this time it involves Lady Gaga. According to an industry source that spoke with News Nation, Lady Gaga gave her powerhouse Manhattan law firm, Grubman, Shire, Mazzales, and Sachs, well, she gave them an ultimatum. If they didn't drop P. Diddy as a client, she was taking her business elsewhere. So the law firm dumped P. Diddy last week. He had been their client for over 20 years. The source told News Nation that the law firm felt that if Lady Gaga left and was vocal about it, then other high-profile clients would also exit. So they cut their losses and they cut out P. Diddy. The law firm represents clients like U2, Drake, Madonna, Lil Nas X, Barbra Streisand, and Elton John. And P. Diddy has been absent from social media, from the limelight, since his apology video, if that's what you want to call it, that referenced the abuse of Cassie. He dropped that apology video on Instagram in May, but last week, he scrubbed his entire Instagram account. And following the alleged abuse of Cassie, Mayor Adams of New York City revoked P. Diddy's honorary key to the city. And there's more, you guys. Diddy has been in a legal back and forth since 2021 with Sean John LLC and GBG USA Incorporated. Okay, those are the former business entities that owned Diddy's clothing line. Well, Vibe magazine is reporting that Diddy has dropped his $60 million lawsuit against the brand's former owners and that the entities have reached a very casual agreement. He initially sued the companies for using his likeness and image after he sold 90% of his stake to the owners in 2016. Diddy seemed to be disappointed in their marketing attempts, so he filed that suit. But it now seems P Diddy and his actions are severing many of his ties in the music industry. I, of course, will keep you updated on the P Diddy case. And then finally today, as of this morning, we still do not have a verdict in the Karen Reed trial. She's accused of angrily plowing over her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, when she dropped him off at a fellow police officer's home for a continued night of drinking. Now, the jury, made up of 6 men and 6 women, completed their 4th full day of jury deliberations on Friday. This was all following the 2-month trial. Karen's defense team is arguing she was framed by colleagues of John's, saying they are the ones who killed and dumped his body in the snow. Well, on Friday, the many supporters who have gathered outside of the courthouse clashed, some extolling Karen's innocence and some holding signs that say "rot in jail" and "she's guilty." Now, witnesses who have testified at the trial claim they have received death threats from Karen's supporters. And I need to remind you, most of those supporters she doesn't even know. The jury began its 5th day of deliberation this morning, and I'll keep watching and reporting on Rise and Crime, and make sure you watch Peyton's reporting on Into the Dark and on Murder with My Husband. All right, you guys, that's your Monday episode of Rise and Crime. I'm going to ask a special favor. Please share the show with a friend, or if you're loving the content, I would love for you to drop a 5-star review or a positive comment. That always helps the show grow. And of course, like and follow us on all of our social media and YouTube accounts that we have here at Ono Media. You can join me again on Thursday for more morning crime news. I'm Mama Jules, and keep safe out there.